And welcome to The Bond, where we're going to learn how to bond with nature. And today we're going to learn about a think tank named Berggruen. Berggruen is an institute which is based in Southern California, but they actually have a global presence. And our guest today is Nils. He has a PhD and is a scholar that focuses on so many different things: globalization, historic power, the transformation of a society. And in that, he has done not only studying, but he's helped to create ideas. So he works with the Berggruen Institute, which informs decision makers. Now, why does that matter to us? Because these decisions might impact our everyday life. So, for example, if a policy was created which would help to develop a park nearby, and we meet our friends and socialize at that park, and we walk our dogs at that park, then that's a policy that impacts our lives. So let's go behind the scenes and see how those policies are actually created and how those ideas actually come to be. Now, the Berggruen Institute, and Nils in particular, have actually been an author of several books. For example, Mandarins of the Future, Modernization Theory in a Cold War America was then America's Condition, the History of the United States in 1945, and Deviant, Globalization, the Black Market Economy in the 21st Century. So here we'd like to welcome Nils and find out a little bit more about what he has done and how we can pick his brain. So Nils, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we're really excited to have you here. And I'd love to ask the first foundational question, which is, can you tell me a little bit about how the Institute was developed, on what principles, and tell us a little bit more about the 21st Century Council.
Sure. So the Institute was set up originally in late 2010, and we're based here in Los Angeles. It was founded by Nils Berggruen, who is a Franco-German-American financier, and Nathan Gardell's the co-founder, who is a longtime political journalist and political operative, I suppose you would say, here in California. And in 2010, some of your listeners, viewers may remember, a lot of stuff seemed like it was really broken, particularly here in California, right? You had Governor Schwarzenegger, who couldn't pass a budget at the national level. Obama had just lost the midterms. The Tea Party had come in. There was the global financial crisis, which was really roiling markets all over the world, particularly in Europe. And so there was a sense that sort of at every level of government, state level, national level, international level, governance systems were kind of broken. And what we wanted to do when we set up the organization, now almost 15 years ago, was to begin to bring new ideas to think about how governance can work better. And one of the first initiatives in that regard was setting up the 21st Century Council, which you just mentioned. 21st Century Council was essentially a kind of a shadow organization to the G20. The G20 was deployed after the start of the financial crisis by the Obama administration to try to create a talking shop between the 20 largest economies in the world to ensure that there'd be more effective coordination in response to the global financial crisis. And they would meet every... So
I was just sort of wondering, so was it set up, the 21st Century Council set up to help us influence others globally, or be influenced by others?
Basically to help agenda set. So for all of these kinds of international confabs that you go to, there's usually plenty of meetings that happen before the meeting that set up what the agenda of that meeting is going to be. And the 21st Century Council was one of those kinds of organizations. We would meet about 6 months before each G20 meeting. There would be representatives from, usually either former heads of state or former finance ministers from each of these 20 countries were participants in the G20, in the 21st Century Council shadow meeting before the G20, and we'd say, hey, maybe we should be thinking about how do we include, green finance in some of the bonds that are being issued, or how do we include, make sure that as we do the economic interventions to help stabilize the economy, we create a more equitable financial and economic system in the aftermath of that. And so those were the kinds of things that the 21st Century Council were really focused on.
Okay, and so how did that develop into some of your other committees? Like you have the Think Long Committee, and so... Yeah,
so the 21st Century Council was focused on the sort of international level. The Think Long Committee was focused on the state of California, the state level. And here there were different issues that were at stake, and it was a totally different setup. Basically, in the case of the Think Long Committee, it was about a dozen people chaired by the former head of the California Supreme Court, Ron George.
Oh.
There were 4 former Republican, 4 former Democrat politicians that were on this, as well as several prominent business leaders. And there were several specific initiatives that the 21st Century Council helped push through between 2011 and 2013, including the creation of the Rainy Day Fund, which was really important, for example, during the pandemic, because it provided a backstop to the finances for the state. It also did some initiative reform to try to make sure that the legislature would be able to be more effective. There were also things that the Think Long Committee tried to do that were maybe a bridge too far. Some of the tax reform proposals never really got off the ground, but there were some really important successes early on with the Think Long Committee.
So are you saying that the Think Long Committee, when you said that, for example, during the pandemic, when it was a backstop, did it actually help develop the policy that California adopted?
That's right. So what the Think Long Committee did is that there was a series of meetings that took place, some of them in Los Angeles, some of them in the Bay Area, some of them in Sacramento, where these 13 people would get together and they formulated some proposed legislation to, for example, create the Rainy Day Fund. That law, I believe, was passed in 2012 or 2013, and then became relevant during the economic downturn that was caused by the pandemic and the economic shutdown that was associated with that.
Interesting. So with all of this background and the fervor that you have for this, and with your background and everything that you've studied, have you thought about planning the ideal city?
Well, urbanism is something I'm personally pretty interested in, and obviously, I've lived most of my life in San Francisco and Los Angeles, actually, but I've also lived in other places like Boston and DC and Paris, and I don't know that there's such a thing as an ideal city. I think cities grow organically. Part of what's fun about cities is that they have, they have their own kind of independent way of developing. Sometimes they're centrally planned, but mostly they grow kind of organically. I like cities that have a lot of nature nearby. One of the reasons I like living in Los Angeles is that even though this is a big, dense global city, it doesn't take you very long to get up to mountains or get down to the beach, get out to the deserts, where it's a totally different kind of environment.
Right. Lots of nature if you want to go for a nice, beautiful hike in the fresh morning air. Oh, yeah, that's gorgeous. So tell me about the Future of Capitalism initiative and how that blends with sustainability.
Yeah, I think our major idea in the Future of Capitalism project has been around what we call pre-distribution or universal basic capital. So obviously one of the big stories of the last 30, 40 years has been that while an enormous amount of prosperity and wealth has been created, it's been very heavily concentrated at the top of the wealth and income scale.
Okay.
And one of the ideas that's been really popular around that has been the idea that there should be a universal basic income or a kind of reverse income tax. That's an idea that goes all the way back to the 1970s and Richard Nixon, actually. Milton Friedman had proposals of that sort. But our idea is a little different. Instead of spreading the income around, the idea is we believe that we should actually spread capital around. Everybody should become or have an opportunity to get an ownership stake in all the cool businesses that are being created. And this is not just a fictional idea. It's already being created in places like Singapore or places like Norway, or even in places like Alaska, where, for example, every member of everybody who lives who's a citizen of Alaska or even just a resident of Alaska has a stake in the oil revenues that are being pulled out of the ground. So there's all this amazing development of companies and technology companies that are creating vast new sources of wealth. And we really believe that that wealth should be shared much more broadly.
So does that make the citizens who are participating in this more invested in the success of that industry?
Exactly. I think it's a way of generating more political legitimacy for the enormous wealth creation that capitalism creates. A lot of people are skeptical of capitalism because they feel like it only creates some winners. This is a way of making sure that everybody can be a winner out of the whole process. Okay,
so what you're doing is you're saying you should definitely have a good, thriving business, but the citizens that are nearby that can actually help keep you as a leader in industry should also get some sort of a reward for supporting you, whether they're an employee or something.
That's exactly right. So, obviously a lot of our thinking on this comes out of what's happening with tech companies. Tech companies are, some of them are trillion-dollar companies in terms of their valuation right now.
Sure.
And their valuation is based on the fact that they are, bringing together data from their users and aggregating them and assembling them in various ways and creating products on the basis of all of that data. And the idea is that, that kind of input ought to be rewarded more broadly so that all the users should also be able to be owners of these apps.
I think that's fantastic. Well, We need to take a quick break, but when we come back, I would love for you to go ahead and share a little bit more about planetary thinking and the concept behind that. So stay with us. We'll be right back.
Humans, or at least we moderns, tended to think of our relationship with nature as one of separation and maybe dominion, if not domination. Over the last century plus, scientists have revealed that that fundamental assumption about the way in which humans relate to nature is fundamentally a fiction. These are all problems without passports. We need a new set of institutions, a new set of categorically different institutions that are specifically designed to address these planetary challenges. I'm Nils Gilman, and I'm the co-author of Children of a Modest Star.
And welcome back. We are here with Nils from the Berggruen Institute, a think tank in Southern California. So, Nils, like we said right before we went to break, you mentioned something in one of your books about Children of the Modest Star, about how planetary thinking might actually be able to impact the way we handle crises. So could you explain what planetary thinking is and how it can help us with crisis management?
Sure. So the idea of planetary thinking is really in contrast to global thinking. Most of the kind of people have talked about globalization, obviously, for several decades. And when people talk about globalization, they're mostly talking about the flows of things around the world that people move around intentionally. So money, ideas, goods, services, maybe also some negative things, right? Drugs, guns, memes. These are all things that people are moving around the earth intentionally.
Right.
But then there's all this other stuff that's happening that's flowing around the earth that's sometimes affected by humans, certainly affects humans, but isn't being done intentionally. So all the carbon that we emit from the tailpipe of our car or from our factories, that goes into the atmosphere and affects people all over the planet, right?
Okay.
Or viruses. Viruses don't care about our borders. People aren't intentionally moving viruses around.
Exactly.
And the management of those kinds of challenges, the challenges that are caused by things like atmospheric carbon increases, which causes global warming, or viruses that cause diseases. These things are not things that can be effectively managed by nation states because they have nothing to do with our borders, right? So our systems of global governance that have been set up to manage relationships between different governments are not really suited and effective for dealing with things that have nothing to do with governments and nothing really to do with humans. We need a different way of thinking and conceptualizing and ultimately governing those kinds of challenges that are associated with things like that. So climate change would be one example. Okay. Pandemic risk management would be another. But then there's also things like biodiversity loss or oceanic plastics or space junk. All of these are things that don't respect our borders and therefore need a different kind of governance system in order to be effectively managed.
I see. Okay, so when you're talking about crisis management, then you're saying basically we want to respond in a cohesive manner with all of the other nations that would respond in a similar way. So everyone sort of knows what to expect. When a bad thing happens to the United States, we're going to respond this way, and you can expect that as a form of consistency. Am I understanding?
That's right.
Okay.
That's exactly right. And that sometimes may mean that national governments have to compromise a little bit on their sovereignty. I'll give you one example of something like this that already exists.
Okay.
During the Cold War, many of your viewers will, remember or at least heard of the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the U.S. and the Soviet Union almost got into a nuclear war. And one of the things that came out of that was an inspection regime under the auspices of the International Atomic Energy Agency. So then nuclear facilities all over the world, people could build nuclear power plants, or if you had nuclear weapons, you could also have those inspected. And you would think that that's a real intrusion on a country's sovereignty, right?
Okay.
But people were willing, both in Moscow and in DC, to give up that sovereignty because the risk of nuclear war was so horrible and such a horrible prospect that they were willing to compromise their sovereignty to deal with that. I think that there are other kinds of risks that are almost as bad as that, as a nuclear war. The prospect of runaway climate change, the prospect, this last pandemic actually wasn't that severe, right? It killed a lot of people, but less than 1/10 of 1% of the population. There's been other pandemics historically that killed as many as like 25% of the population. During the Black Death in Europe, almost 1/3 of the population of all of Europe got wiped out in just a couple of years.
Yeah, I'm not sure how we would have handled that if it was that severe.
Well, exactly. We felt the lockdowns, and obviously all of us who lived through that, it was a really traumatic experience for everybody, no matter where you fell out on what you thought the government ought to or ought to not do. It was a bad experience, but it was nothing compared to what it might have been and what it might be in the future. And my belief is that we ought to be getting ready for that now so that we can nip a risk like that in the bud before it becomes a global pandemic again.
That makes sense. So can you explain to me how you are, your views sort of mix with the book of Intelligence Governance for the 21st Century? Because that seems to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to say that the West is very good in marketing an idea, but they generally have short-term thinking, and the East is better in long-term planning, but they don't really have those checks and balances on authority and power. And so we sort of need a merit-based system where just the best quality person or the most qualified is in a position of leadership. So how does that thinking jive with that philosophy?
Well, that's the book that's written by the co-founders of the Institute, Nils Berggruen and Nathan Gardels. They published it a few years ago, and your summary of it is quite fair. I think these are complementary. The things that I talk about in my book and the things that they talk about in their book are complementary in the following sense.
Okay.
I think it's really important, if we're going to think about there being some planetary agencies like the International Atomic Energy Agency, that these be staffed with really high quality, technically high quality people. Every society has elites, and sometimes the elites are better in some societies than in others. They're more technically adept, they're more civic minded, they're less self-serving. My own belief is that, in the United States and in large parts of the West, we've ended up in the last few decades with a very self-serving set of elites. And we need to go back to having true meritocracy, where people who really are good at things are put in positions of power. And so that, I think, dovetails with the arguments that Berggruen and Gardels make in their book.
In that book. So let me ask you then, when you're saying about elites that are a little bit more selfish, can you talk to me about the concept of corruption? Because corruption, if it's defined, is a way that someone is able to game the system or find some sort of a loophole where they personally benefit, but it's usually at the cost of someone else. So if a merit-based society is useful, how do you prevent the highest level governing bodies from becoming corrupt and just saying, well, let me just be the source of all the money, or something like that? So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's exactly what's actually happened in the United States over the last few decades. I mean, I think that we have a system today for selecting elites that is, we can talk for a long time about the education system and the way in which those things work, but it's gamed at several levels. One is that if you're born to a family with privilege, it's way, way easier for you to get into the track that will take you into an elite position than if you're a person who is not born into that kind of privilege. So that's one problem we have, is we get people who are gaming the system at the level of getting into the elite positions. Now, there's a second problem we have with our elites in this country today, which is that once those elites get into positions of power, they often, hoard a great deal of benefit for themselves, and including passing on their elite status to their children or their friends in ways that may not be fully deserved. So we have corruption of the process of meritocratic selection at a lot of different levels. Fixing that's going to be a very complicated problem.
But we need to have corruption addressed in order to have society as a whole believe in the institution, right? If I think that the institution is corrupt and isn't for my benefit, then I'm going to think it's just window dressing and not substantial at all.
That's right. I mean, I think that part of the loss of legitimacy and trust in institutions in our society. And there's a lot of data around this. It's been going downhill for 50 years. If you look at almost every institution in our society, churches, big businesses, the federal government, state government, almost every one of these, there's been a decline in trust and a decline in legitimacy over the last 30, 40 years. The only exceptions for that decline in trust and legitimacy tends to be, one, small businesses, and two, the military. And I think that the reason why those two institutions in America have continued to have a lot of sort of high status is that they're perceived as some of the least corrupt institutions in America and some of the most genuinely meritocratic. I mean, if you're running a small business in this country, it's really hard to be corrupt. I mean, you've got to provide a good service to your customers or people don't come back and you have no way to game the system. Likewise, the military, in my opinion, and I should say I've never served, but I know lots of people who have and have family members who have, is probably the most truly meritocratic system or institution in the country. There are very rigorous standards that determine how you get promoted from, being a lieutenant to being a captain to being a major to being a colonel to being a general. When you get to the very top levels, it might get a little bit political, but it really is a true meritocracy. And I think people recognize that and respect the military for that. You look at other institutions in our society, it's hard to say the same thing.
Well, that's really interesting. So let me ask, in one of your books, you mentioned that it would be useful to develop a department in government that would address a specific issue. And I'm just sort of wondering how establishing new departments would sort of work with the fact that you also need to get rid of corruption to have those institutions trusted. So it's a balance between reforming of government versus creating new sort of very niche specific functions. Can you?
Yeah, so I think the question you're asking is, even if we had a meritocracy, a perfect meritocracy, where really people who were really talented were put in positions of power to make decisions over, regulating, say, pandemic risk, right? That would not necessarily, just because they were selected on the basis of true merit, mean that once they got into those positions of power, that they wouldn't, game the system for their own benefit in one way or another, either financially or otherwise, right? So it's a totally legitimate question. And you think you absolutely have to have, therefore, checks and balances and transparency and inspection regimes. And this is why, if you look at, most government agencies in this country, and most large corporations for that matter, have things like inspectors general or ombudsmen or whistleblower policies, because you need to have that kind of a system in place so that if, some people are going to be corrupt. That's just how it is. I mean, people have sin in their hearts. And you therefore have to have a certain way of monitoring that process that is transparent in order for people to have confidence in the elites who are running those institutions.
But you also need to enforce those policies. So even if you have those policies in place that are checks and balances, there needs to still be some external force that's enforcing that. Otherwise... That's right. Right.
That's right. There's got to be some system. I mean, you can see, for example, with our Supreme Court in the United States right now, that this is where it's kind of failed. I mean, there are official set of policies that the Supreme Court itself has put forward around, in order to create the appearance, both the reality and the transparent appearance of non-corruption. And some of those policies have been flagrantly violated by some of the members of the Supreme Court over the last few years. And there's been no consequences. And the result is, if you look at the amount of confidence people have in the Supreme Court as a trusted institution, it's really fallen through the floor over the last 5-10 years, precisely for this reason, because there's no mechanism right now to enforce the anti-corruption policies that are officially in place. So you have to have mechanisms that can hold people accountable. And obviously, the ultimate way to do that is a way to force people out of office if they're behaving in corrupt ways. And that's a really important process that needs to be, a high enough bar. People need to be able to have due process if they're accused of being corrupt, to be able to defend themselves. Obviously, that's important too. But if in fact they have been corrupt, they need to be able to, they need to be held accountable for that, for sure.
And it sounds like all of this also impacts the quality of life for the average everyday people, especially when it comes to cleanliness of water, like Flint, Michigan, and breathable air, and making sure that manufacturing spills don't poison our water and all that. So it's,
I mean, I think that's exactly right. You look at something like, the Environmental Protection Agency, which was established, over half a century ago now. The Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act. I mean, these are really important landmark pieces of legislation that, they don't work perfectly. You brought up the example of Flint. There's numerous places in the United States where the water is unhealthy, either because there's bacterial matter in it, or there's heavy metals, or a variety of other things. But we do have, regulatory system in place that, guarantees clean water and clean air, or at least it's trying to safeguard that. And for the most part, I think the people who are working in those agencies, the accusation against them isn't that they're corrupt. I mean, I think that these are hardworking civil servants that, for the most part, are doing a lot of good in the world. I mean, I'm sure there's individual instances. These are large agencies with tens of thousands of people.
Sure.
There's obviously always going to be a few people in any organization that size who are behaving badly. But for the most part, these are really good, important organizations that make the quality of life for everybody better.
Well, I think that's really fascinating, and you are filled with ideas, and I would love to continue this, but maybe on another time. We have run out of time, so I need to say thank you, everyone, for joining us, and we really want to appreciate Nils for being a true representative of the Berggruen Institute and sharing his amazing insights and how it affects their ability to bond with nature. And with that, I want to say thank you for joining us, and until we bond again.